Freedom is arguably the biggest buzzword throughout racing game design in the past few decades. The earliest innovators in open worlds were the first to expand upon this idealization of freedom in driving games. And yet, if you ask me, there's one game that took this hypothetical concept through its largest virtual jump, and that's Test Drive Unlimited. You see, in 2006 when Unlimited released, Test Drive wasn't exactly synonymous with the 6th generation consoles and the technology that they brought forward. The games preceding Unlimited were far more linear in scope, whether that be on-road, off-road, or on the track. TDU, though, would be the breaker of these limits. Developed by Atari's newly acquired Eden Games, who had previously had development on the PlayStation version of Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed and the V-Rally games, TDU would switch the course of Test Drive Unlimited for good, accomplishing the Herculean feat of recreating Hawaii's stunning Oahu Island at a 1-to-1 scale, a task the scope of which would be lunacy a generation beforehand. Freedom would be the core selling point of TDU. This wasn't for the racing and tuner crowd who flocked to Need for Speed or Juiced, and would be far less exuberant than the burnouts of this era. Test Drive Unlimited was a lifestyle experience mixed with a driving game, something that no other game at that time could provide, and that's why this series has gained such reverence over the years. And years it's been. Nearly 2 decades separate the original Test Drive Unlimited and the modern day, and so the question is then raised, how have those nearly 20 years treated it? I hope to answer that very question as I welcome you to my Test Drive Unlimited retrospective. The most important place to start when diving into a project such as Test Drive Unlimited is just what this brought to the forefront in 2006. The early 2000s were a far more experimental time for racing games than ever before. The tuner boom was in full swing, plenty of arcade series still stocked shelves, and diversity in terrain was greatly expanded upon through games such as MotorStorm. As a whole, the genre was moving away from the racing games which defined the 90s, which were far more streamlined around exotics and supercars. And for the Test Drive series as a whole, how would it evolve? Apart from Test Drive Ferrari Racing Legends in 2012, the mantra that these games would hold was to bring forth a driving game, the likes of which had never been seen before. And now, 20 years later, we have still never seen a driving game quite match up to the qualitative jump in innovation that the original Test Drive Unlimited brought to the table in 2006, all of which could run on a Blummin PS2 and PSP, mind you. The lifestyle element, which I mentioned during the intro to this video, was the predominant differentiator to the Need for Speed Most Wanted and even the Outrun 2006 of its time. You see, in a strange way, TDU surprisingly targeted a more niche audience who wasn't necessarily interested in strictly racing games. Many of its pieces would attract in a more casual audience, who this high-life piece of escapism would appeal to. Luxury clothing stores, car dealerships you could hop into and spec out your dream cars, real estate agencies all over Oahu that you could use to collect vast luxury estates across the island. And to string this all together, a game focused on driving, exploring, and occasionally racing throughout this vast island. All of this to channel the creative vision of the ultimate luxury fantasy through a driving game. This was not just a rival for the traditional racing game, but for those such as Grand Theft Auto or many of the other sandbox-style games of its time period, who many would simply use as an escape to channel the same fantasy that I mentioned earlier. It's quite funny looking back today, in 2024. Back in 2006 and even 2011 when Test Drive Unlimited 2 released, both of those games innovated and introduced features the Grand Theft Auto series would eventually bring into their games. And yet the most recent TDU game struggles to match up to that same standard, but that's a whole separate video. Another huge driver for Test Drive Unlimited was its MMO functionality. Most online functions in racing games at the time were rudimentary at best, and here comes Test Drive Unlimited as an MOOR, or as they called it, Massively Online Open Racing. Just marketing jargon for a racing game MMO. This was, however, super neat for its time. You could cruise around and find other people all through Oahu, challenge them to a one-on-one race just with the press of one button, or even host some more organized races. Now, as I write this script, the online has long since died, but there are some truly incredible fan projects such as Project Paradise that you can find online which have done outstanding work on reviving this to an even better spot than at launch. What I've always loved about TDU's online functionality is that it was all completely optional. You'd simply be prompted, whether on console, PC, or PSP, if when you booted the game you wanted to play online or offline, something the latest should have absolutely included. And yet the experience was very similar either way, with AI-controlled NPCs that would patrol the world and act as stand-ins for real players. All of this in 2006 says a lot when most modern racing games either haven't evolved much further than this, and some can't even match this same level of quality. The online component of Test Drive Unlimited was far ahead of its time, mirroring the functionality and style of even today's racing games all the way back in 2006. But how does the single player hold up in 2024? Tackling Test Drive Unlimited's career mode is very different compared to many of its contemporaries, and this is entirely due to their creative visions. You see, the early 2000s were a very different time. Any racing game that you'd buy off the shelf was primarily sold off of how one would harness its single-player or campaign modes. This was before the era of sandboxes and open-world exploration being the main reason that you bought a racing game. Just look at Underground 2, Most Wanted, and Midnight Club 2 as examples here. While each one of these games were open-world to a degree, the main reason that you'd buy them is to progress throughout their careers. Maybe do some driving during your runtime, and then you'd pop it back onto the shelf once you're done. It's very important that I preface before I go and dissect this game's campaign that TDU was not like its competition. This was a game that you played over time, more sharing the vision of Gran Turismo in this regard, although of course with drastically different scopes and presentation. Sure, there was a campaign that you complete from start to finish, but that wasn't the main appeal. I'd argue that Test Drive Unlimited was the first real sandbox-style racing game, one that set the blueprint that 2 decades later this genre is still chasing. And with that out of the way, just how does the actual meat of this campaign mode hold up? Well, in terms of premise, the game leaves you with hardly any exposition or world building for what exactly you're playing, something that was drastically improved upon in the sequel. In this game, however, you start off mid-cutscene in an airport terminal, getting some beauty shots and giving you a taste of all of your selectable characters. Once that's said and done, in the space of, say, 5 minutes, you'll grab a rental car as soon as you hop off the plane, buy a first car from one of 3 dealerships, and then you, in all honesty, just get dropped in to explore the game for yourself. There's no hand-holding here. Is that a bad thing? No, not at all. In fact, the whole no-nonsense approach works very well for plenty of people. This is very much built around that KISS mentality. Keep it simple, stupid. The career here feels very traditional. You'll drive around the map finding new events to partake in, win enough of them, and you'll unlock a higher tier fleet of races to hop into. Bare bones, yes, but there also means that ain't much to go wrong. The events that you'll complete thankfully have a good amount of variation to them, which helps keep the gameplay from getting stale. Your expected race and time trials are about as by the book as things go, though some do mix things up with a driving meter which will fail your race if you hit traffic or go off-road past a certain threshold, and some which will have you setting a destined top speed before you run out of time, though those don't really put up much of a challenge. Where things get really unusual is through everything else. Knockout races, speed traps, vehicle transport missions, hitchhikers, hell, you can even be a courier for packages or supermodels. This game is certainly 2000s. For a game so simple on paper, it really does try its best to always have you doing something new. Whether that's driving a new car for a courier mission, unlocking motorcycles late game, which I'll touch on later, or even just telling you where the next event is on your agenda, and then sending you on a 30-kilometer road trip past islands or forests to get there. This is absolutely a brilliant game if you just want no nonsense, no fluff, driving game fun. What's actually quite funny is that on a methodical level, this game's campaign functions very similar to this year's Solar Crown. Complete a free-flowing group of events, explore, and eventually unlock a higher tier cars and racing. The template is very much the same, but because this template is the same, it's honestly quite laughable to see how this game still handles a career better than its 2024 brother. Something quite neat for a game of this vintage is the custom route creator. You can set checkpoint-based time attacks or speed traps with fully customizable regulations. All of this in 2006 is wildly impressive, with games like Forza Horizon only introducing custom blueprints which function as an evolution of this same concept in 2016, 10 years later. Without a doubt, something that I feel TDU does exceptionally well is the sense of accomplishment. Earning money for upgrades and vehicles takes quite a bit of time, continuing into the late game. However, it's not artificially inflated either. This is such a great sweet spot where you can spend a whole afternoon grinding, exploring, and getting some career progression in, without feeling like making money is a chore in order to enjoy the game. The TDU tradition of exuberantly long races originated from Unlimited, with both the Island Tour and Millionaire's Challenge challenge, each being over 100 miles long, and will take at least 45 to 50 minutes of your time to complete, yet rewarding you with voracious amounts of cash. And hell, if you want to bait the system without spending tons of money on cars, you can use the rental cars feature for a specified period of time, which is a great way to mix things up and try new cars without, of course, the large upfront investment. Now, is TDU all that challenging? No, not really. Spare for working around a few technical issues that I've faced. Now, I'm sure someone will comment with a link to a mod that'll fix these things, but from simply playing the standard game on PC, I had some serious issues which caused grinding through this campaign to be at times an unplayable mess. Most primarily, the invisible cars bug. I'm not the only one, as this has been very well documented. But throughout my playthrough, I constantly had to drive on the shoulders of the road as traffic cars sometimes straight up do not display on screen, though you can still hit them just as well as if they were. In a game where driving penalties and time limits can exist, this caused some properly infuriating moments where I just refused to keep playing the game due to this compounding over long periods of time. This alongside plenty and plenty of unfixable freezes, once even 40 minutes into the hour-long Millionaires Challenge. Thanks, TDU. Take this all on the side, as once again, you may personally not face these, especially on consoles, but it's something to be aware of when playing on PC, as while I undeniably had a ton of fun with the game, it isn't all sunshine and roses. Unlike our sponsor, Instant Gaming. If you've been watching us for the past few months, then you know the deal by now. You want games for a far better price than retail? Of course you do. Head over to Instant Gaming and grab one of their keys, all of which come from authorized resellers, so you know your money is in good hands. Whether you're on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or Switch, you can browse their vast catalog of games, both old, new, and occasionally delisted. Hell, you can even pre-order plenty of games you've been looking forward to. Instant Gaming also continues to support you guys, by allowing me to host a free game giveaway every month. All you've got to do is follow that link in the description right next to the one with their website, or scan that QR code on screen. Big ups once again to Instant Gaming for their incredible continued support. And let's get back to the video. Cars. What's a driving game without them? If there's one thing aside from the obviously different changes in map design that set TDU apart from any other racing series, it's how these games tackled their vehicles. Test Drive Unlimited didn't just have a far larger list than its contemporary Need for Speed rivals, with its over 100-strong list, in comparison to the paltry 36 in Most Wanted and 57 in Carbon, but showed a far different style of presentation and attention to detail than any game beforehand. First off, first-person cameras. Far from the first game to include a first-person camera, but for an open-world game, let alone one that had this level of fidelity, and included the ability to customize your field of view, height, and driving position, unheard of apart from sim racers in 2006. The tachometer for each vehicle in third person as well wasn't just another piece of the UI, it was an exact replica of every single one of over the 100 cars' gauges. Damn, that's cool. You can even start and stop your engines, and even this detail was spared some love, with older classic cars having a prolonged startup in comparison to more modern vehicles. And these are just the itty-bitty details. There's so much more when we look at the package as a whole. I'm sure most of you are familiar with dealerships as, well, at least for me, this was the one thing that seduced me into falling in love with this franchise. Even now in 2024, compared to the rather insipid dealerships in the latest Solar Crown, these hold up so well. There isn't only a plethora of dealerships focusing on British, Italian, Japanese, German cars, but each one was tailor-made for their specific brand or theme. Take a look at not only the color palettes of each one, but the geometric makeup. Mercedes is a single floor with simple, clean aesthetics. Alfa Romeo has 2 floors and a more colorful theme. The more prodigious brands such as Lamborghini have balconies with cars up on ramps. Hell, even pulling up and parking up at these dealerships have unique cinematics. It just feels special. You can of course spec out your cars to your heart's innermost desire. Exterior, interior, wheels, all from each brand's respective catalog. That first drive feeling, after you've spent a few hours racing, earned yourself enough money to spec out a real slick ride, and just cruising down the highway, is unmatched by anything apart from other TDUs, because it feels so personal. What I have to touch on is the selection of cars on offer here, because I firmly believe that when you have all of the DLC, this is one of the greatest car lists in racing history. What I appreciate even more in comparison to its successors is how much variety that there is here. Anything from Nismo S-Tune 350Zs, R34 Skylines, S281 Salines, Volkswagen W12 Roadster, Saturn Sky, 4 McLaren F1 variants, the Mercedes CLK DTM, Lexus's entire range of sedans, from the IS to the LS, and I haven't even mentioned the concept cars. The Cobra concept, Chrysler ME412, Saturn Curve, the Holden FG, which I didn't even know existed. I could ramble about this game's car list for the rest of this video because there is just so much good, weird stuff. If you like anything cool from the early 2000s, which isn't a BMW or a Porsche, Test Drive Unlimited likely has it. And honestly, you're bound to fall in love with plenty of others. This is just such a great era of automobiles. And you know what? They don't drive like trash. I've said many a time that while TDU 2 was one of my all-time favorite racing games, the handling and physics model can be a bit impious at times. One of the many quirks you have to wrap your head around while playing. With TDU though, I've gotta say 99% of the time the physics here are just good old fun. Now before I say anything else, I have to contextualize that the only way I could use a controller with this game is by steering with the D-pad due to this game's poor controller support. Back to the PS1 days, I suppose. Even with that, I had no trouble catching slides, sending it through high-speed corners, or even just maneuvering slowly while cruising. If I could use one word to describe the physics model in TDU, it would be solid. And in more ways than just one. It's not complex to learn, it doesn't have any weird tricks to wrap your head around. But it also doesn't have much fluidity or roll to it, which again leads into that solid feeling. But more than anything, it's just plain simple, which is exactly what it should be. I think if I do had to critique one thing though, there is that lack of body roll or motion, as if vehicles simply rotate on an x-axis alone without much vertical or diagonal motion through suspension travel, which surprisingly doesn't feel as jarring as that may sound. The vehicle audio design is, well, never been this series' strong suit, but for this era they're serviceable, albeit with that vacuum cleaner-esque compressed tone that many old racers had. It certainly keeps the cars feeling dated, but not in a bad way. And that's the best way to summarize the cars alone. They're very much of the era. You won't be blown away by how anything feels modern, because they don't. But they feel good, and that's more important to me. But TDU doesn't just have cars for you to whip around. If you're a fan of racing on two wheels, there is a small selection of motorcycles to choose and race in. Motorcycles in TDU 2 to me just feel like their inclusion in Burnout Paradise. It's a neat gimmick, and for bike people they'll probably get a sweet kick out of them, but they just aren't that well implemented. There are hardly any motorcycle events, and to even buy one in the first place you have to discover each and every one of the car dealers. Then you can buy your first bike. The motorcycle physics as well. It feels absolutely criminal to ride a motorcycle and not feel any semblance of roll, as that's quite literally how these things corner. It isn't just side-to-side weight transfer, but front to back. You just don't feel that full sense of motion you would on a real motorcycle. They're cool, don't get me wrong, but mediocre in implementation, which for me just isn't enough to truly enjoy them. TDU's vehicles provided something far different to its competition. It wasn't focused on the most in-depth upgrade system or give you the most ostentatious selection of body kits and wings. It was far more down to earth, putting the millionaire's dreams in the palm of your hands and letting you cruise endlessly across the largest map this genre was yet to see. You've likely heard the buzzwords by now. Over 1,000 kilometers of drivable roads, a one-to-one virtual recreation of Oahu, Hawaii. The scale of this map, not only by the standards in 2006, but in the modern day, trounces every other game, spare for few exceptions such as Fuel. The question that I then want to answer is if this game's map is actually any good. Now, spoiler alert, I certainly think that it is. There are a few caveats that I want to bring up for the sake of viewing all sides. It's very reasonable to expect that a recreation of such a large scape of land will not be able to match up to the level of detail that you'd find in other racing games with a more compact map design philosophy. That's just a given. And this is certainly something that you notice, especially when looking at this game in comparison to TDU 2. Unlimited has plentiful roads, yes, but diversity in viewpoints, terrain, and even just colors hardly changes throughout the vast network of roads. I for one believe, especially for a game of this vintage, that this simply is not a big deal to me. Sure, I love a great view, and it's always fun exploring a more artistically comprehensive racing game world for the first time. But for me, if this is going to be a game that I come back to over and over again, I want to always be discovering. It's something that, in Forza Horizon for example, always happens after a month or two. I've driven past each and every road many a time, seen all that there is to see. So if I want to buy a new car, go for a fun drive, I'll just be repeating one of a few set routes I've been down before ad nauseum. This of course should go without saying. It's heavily down to personal preference, and I'm in that camp of size over quality in most regards. With the philosophical side out of the way, what about the actual land makeup of Oahu? What I've really grown to love about Unlimited's map is its road design. Sure, while looking at how much of the actual mass here is, well, actually, road, is a bit disappointing, they're undeniably fun to drive on. Some portions of the map are flat, but balance that out with long sweepers alongside beaches. Some combine both steep changes in elevation and sharp corners, and those are real tests. And some spots, just straight, endless freeway to cruise at 200 miles an hour forever. Has Oahu aged particularly well? It's tricky. Comparing this even to TDU 2, if you ask me, it really does struggle to match the diversity and quality that its younger brother provides. And not just that, I find that even though there are a lot of roads to drive on here, most of them lack branching paths and stick towards maintaining one giant path. There's also a heavy lack of an off-road presence, which is tricky, as for some, this is a huge plus. But I disagree on this. TDU 2 strikes a brilliant balance of having its huge network of roadways, and then using the empty space to create their own little dirt paths and rally trails. So then, ambitious this map certainly was, but I'd be dead lying to your face if I said that this map and the philosophy surrounding it didn't have any flaws. And with that, I want to move on to some of my final thoughts on Test Drive Unlimited. So to answer the question from the beginning of the video, how have the almost 2 decades treated Test Drive Unlimited, and how well does it hold up in 2024? Does this feel like a timeless masterpiece? No, absolutely not. But that actually plays into its favor. You see, embracing the time period of when a product releases can often actually be a great thing. It's why Black Box's Need for Speeds hold such reverence. They are still enjoyable experiences, but have reached a point in time where experiencing them is like activating a time capsule to a different point in time. Test Drive Unlimited is almost on that level. For its time, this game was absolutely mega, and when you look back today, you truly do see the bones of which many a modern race are built upon. And sure, while in some ways, we haven't come that much further, going back to Test Drive Unlimited, you start to realize the little things. TDU has so many neat features, gimmicks, and creative choices that still set it apart. But I struggle to find reasons why I would play this over its sequel, which took the concepts that this game started and truly ran with them. As today, Test Drive Unlimited is very simple. The career mode doesn't have a structure, prominent characters, or cutscenes apart from the NPCs that you'll pick up. The map, while huge, is the one source of appeal, as these roads aren't utilized all that well and interactivity within this world isn't all that strong. Its wacky features, such as houses, simply are done better and are fully modeled, traversable, customizable units in its sequel. Hell, even the police that appear, which I haven't even mentioned in this video because they are some of the most poorly implemented in the genre, but that's the price that you pay for ambition sometimes. I don't mean to say any of this as a dig on TDU. This game was, and still is, pretty damn fantastic. And for its era, it truly was fighting the Goliaths of this industry. But yet today, it's best to be appreciated as a marking point, a remnant of a very different era of racing games, as an innovator in this genre. The best way that I've found to analogize TDU 1 is that these days, it feels like a vacation. On first impressions, and for a while, it's comforting, it's fun. But as time goes on, and that initial wave wears off, you start to miss the little things, the quality of life, and you start to wonder, would I truly want to stay here? It's a great game to come back to, but stick too long, and you'll realize just how far that we've come.